Hello everyone and welcome to this first session of the Sustainable Living Leadership Program. We are delighted that you all made it, and we will give everyone 1 minute just to settle a bit on this new platform, to see the screen and to get acquainted with everything. Great, and we will start this meeting as we start many of our spiritual gatherings with a moment of spiritual reflection that Laurie will lead. Slide number 2.
So can we have the first slide, Estrella? So we invite you to a few moments of stillness in which we dedicate our time together to the intention of humanity finding better ways to live in harmony with each other and the earth, our home. We'll have a bell to start and to finish in silence. Thank you, Carolina.
Welcome everyone again to this Sustainable Living Leadership Program. My name is Carolina Bader. I am the director of this program, and I'm really delighted to see so many of you online today in our first session. Living the Change is a program that was launched at the United Nations Climate Conference, COP23, in Germany last fall. And for the first time, institutions and networks from all major faith traditions that you can see on this screen have come together to learn about, commit to, and advocate for lifestyles that are both limiting global warming and are also consistent with our deepest values. We felt that we need to start by ourselves and walk the talk. And we know that as religious communities, we have the chance to do this really at scale. This initiative counts on local faith communities who are engaged and knowledgeable about why this matters, what we can do together, and the difference that this makes in our daily lives, and the joy of practicing and doing this together. So in this leadership program, we're very happy to have you as our local leaders. And we really hope, please go one slide back, that through this leadership program, you will be inspired by the importance of living the change and to be motivated to engage your own community. We hope you will be equipped with knowledge, skills, and resources to really foster sustainable living. We hope that you will gain confidence to organize an inspiring local event on sustainable living during our week of Living the Change. And we hope that you will enjoy a multi-faith network of support with other local leaders from diverse faith communities. On the next slide, you will see that these next 8 weeks will cover several online sessions. We will meet online every 2 weeks. You've seen this information already in the emails. And in between, you are invited to meet your own community and to listen, to talk, and to plan with them together. As you can see here, today is 20th of August. The next meetings will then be on 3rd September, and then every 2 weeks. What is important is the week of Living the Change between 7 and 14 October, which I just quickly want to explain to you as well. So on our next slide, we will see that the week of Living the Change is a very special moment. It's the first global week of Living the Change. Next slide, please. And it focuses around a commitment, making a personal commitment to sustainable living and to sharing about it, to be sharing about it. It focuses also on celebration. We want to celebrate this together through an earth-friendly vegan community meal. And there is some action to it. We really want you to make this event your own through different aspects, for example, a spiritual moment or worship, including arts and music, organizing a community action, showcasing sustainability solutions from your region, and so on. We'll get back to this week of Living the Change, but I wanted to share this with you at the very beginning. This is really the core of this leadership program. Today this meeting is run by several people who are all from the Living the Change team. And I would like to introduce you to this team, to this wonderful team. So next slide, please. My name is Caroline Bader. Then we have the other facilitator for today, Laurie Michaelis, who's joining us from Oxford, London, Oxford, UK. Laurie, maybe you can wave in the camera and just say hello quickly. Laurie.
Oops. Hello.
Great to have you joining us. We're delighted to have 2 speakers today, and that is Kate Power joining us from Copenhagen, Denmark. Kate,
hi.
Hello.
Hi, nice to be here.
And we have Lindsey Field joining us from Bonn, Germany.
Hello.
Great. We also have 2 colleagues to help us with the Zoom hosting and troubleshooting in case there's any technical problems or you have questions. And that is Kristin Barker, from the director of One Earth Sangha, based in Washington, DC. Hello, Kristin. She's waving at you. And we have Estrella Seinberg from Green Faith, who is director of the local organizing of Green Faith. Hi, Estrella.
Hi, everyone. Hi.
And she's joining us from California, early morning. Great, so this is the team for today. It will rotate and change every session. We're the first team. And to get everyone running, I would like to introduce you to some technical aspects of this meeting, just to make sure everyone knows how to navigate this Zoom platform. So on our next slide, we will see some tips. We have really tried to make this meeting as interactive as possible. So don't worry, I won't be speaking all the time, but we really want you to engage as well. And you have different options for doing so. Number 1 is the chat bar. Some of you are using it already. If you go to the lower middle part of your screen, you will see a chat bubble with 3 points and the word chat. If you click on that, you can write a message either to everyone or to one person who's attending this meeting. If you have a technical question, it would be great if you can write to Estrella Seinberg. And if you want to write to everyone, like Surinder is doing right now, you just write to everyone. We will be using this chat for later on for introducing each other, but also for collecting questions to the speakers and the team. So if you have a content question, the chat bar is the right place for that. Number 2 is the poll. We will be using a poll at the beginning. It's quite straightforward. It will show on your screen where you have to click your box. So just follow the instructions on your screen in that moment. And this is just to get a picture of your experience. And thirdly, we have the breakout rooms. Something that is very special to this meeting is that you will have the chance to share and discuss in small teams of only 5 people in the breakout rooms at 2 points of this session. What is important for the breakout rooms, that at a certain moment of the meeting, you will be invited and it will appear on your screen. And then please accept the breakout room invitation. Otherwise you cannot join. You will be automatically moved back to the general plenary when the time is over. And there will be a time alert 60 seconds before this time is over. So you have enough time to chat, but then we'll bring you back to the big meeting room with everyone again. Great. So I would like to test the chat function just to making sure everyone understood. And that is why I would like to know your name, your city and country that you're calling in from right now. So please use the chat, write to everyone your name, your city, and your country. You got 30 seconds for that.
And while those are all coming in, if I can just ask everyone, hi everyone, it's wonderful to be here. Today I'm in the hat of Zoom geek. And so if you're not currently speaking, just make sure that your microphone is muted, just so that we minimize the chance of background noise. Feel free to turn on your video, and you can also, if you want to focus on the current speaker, you can right-click on that picture. Like right now, you could click on me, or you could click on Caroline, and you can choose Spotlight Video or Pin Video, and that way you can focus your attention while everyone else's camera is still on.
Thank you, Kristen. So meanwhile, we've seen many people contributing, and it seems we're really a very diverse group in this leadership training, which is excellent. And you're welcome to continue writing your name, your city, and your country in the chat bar. There's a second question that we have to you, and this we will do through a poll to get a picture of who this group is. I'll invite the poll to be opened, and there's 2 questions to you. Question number 1 will be, what's your main motivation to join this leadership program? And you have multiple choice, multiple answers ready for that. Kristen and Estrella, if you can please open the poll. Question number 2 would be, how would you characterize your familiarity with sustainable living? You want to know a bit of your background experience, where you're coming from. So those 2 questions will be shared in a moment.
Great responses, lots of responses coming in. Thank you, everyone.
Included here that we might not necessarily address by following.
Just a question, I'm not sure everyone can see the poll, if that is not the case.
Are you saying that someone says that they can't see the poll right now? Oh, the folks on the phone. Yeah, if you're on the phone, you won't be able to join the poll. So sorry about that. And we're still gathering. Caroline, would you like me to share in the polling and share the results?
Yes, please.
Okay, great. Okay, here we go. Ah, someone said they could see. You could join through the phone. That is so cool. I didn't know that was possible. Okay, so it looks like we have 15% said learn more about climate change, 35% said learn more about sustainable living, 58% for get skills for local organizing in my community, 42% be able to better communicate about these topics, 42% prepare for an event in our community during the week of living the change, 58%. So we had multiple, you could choose multiple. That's why I was like, huh, 50%? Okay, got it. Network with so prepare an event for, in our community during the week of living the change was 42%. 58% also said network with other like-minded people. 62%, which was the highest of all of them, hear experiences and perspectives from others, so wanting to connect. Find out, because I'm totally new to this field, so I need the basics, 4%, and 31% said become a climate and sustainability advocate. Then on the second question, how would you characterize your familiarity with sustainable living? Unfamiliar to all of this is new to me, 4%. Vaguely familiar, I have a vague understanding. And then 31%, somewhat familiar. I have basic concepts, but not much more. 50% said, I'm very familiar. I know the territory. And 12% said, I'm extremely familiar. I am an expert. I should be the one hosting this webinar. No, they didn't say that. just the I'm an expert part. Okay.
Great,
Thanks,
thank you. Well, thanks everyone for joining that little exercise, and it's great to see the variety again. Well, now you know the team of this call. You know a little bit about the participants joining this call. You'll get to know some people in the breakout rooms later, and this is the moment to actually start our first session officially after this general information. And I'm handing over to Laurie, who will lead you in that. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Carolina. So, well, welcome from me and from the organising partners in Living the Change. So the partners in this initiative have come together around the urgent need to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees and, well, or well below 2 degrees, as the Paris Agreement said. And I think that need's become more obvious to more people in the last few weeks, with the evidence that warming beyond 1.5 degrees could tip the world into a much hotter and a very different kind of climate. We see one of the biggest challenges in caring for the Earth as being the willingness of our politicians, of scientists, of the media, to talk about the need for deep changes in the way we live. And that means changes especially in the aspects of our lives that contribute most to climate change. Our diets, our use of energy in our homes, our personal travel, and especially by car and by air. And I guess our hope through this initiative, our aspiration, our intention is that faith leaders and communities have a particular role to play, because religions, the world's religions, have deeply held values and wisdom about ways of life that truly enable people, our communities and the Earth to flourish. Faith communities have real expertise in supporting people to live and to act in ways that are in line with our values. And there's also a research background to this, that consumption and lifestyles are strongly shaped by the people around us, by the social context, and that to change lifestyles, we need to engage as communities. And faith groups are the strongest communities that we have. Most of the world's people identify with a faith. Faith communities and leaders do have influence on the rest of society, locally and nationally and globally in politics. And we need to use that influence in the most healthy way we can. And that's really probably through our positive example of sustainable living, both being the change and speaking out about it. So in this session today, and you'll see on the agenda slide, we want to focus on recognizing what's brought you into the initiative and our wide variety of motivations in making life choices that perhaps reduce the burden we place on our home, the earth, and that perhaps are more consistent with the values and teaching of our faith traditions. And our speakers in a minute will talk a bit about their perspectives on that. We'll ask you then to talk about your own motivations, and above all, to listen to other people's, to be curious about what inspires them, what sustains them in their choices, and what gets in the way. You may be the lone green in your faith community. I think a lot of us may have experienced that at some time. If so, you've probably learned through hard experience that telling people about climate change does not get them to change their lives. But people do change, and each of us, I hope, has experiences of ways that we have changed. My own motivations for low carbon living are very mixed. I was a vegan cyclist long before I knew anything about climate change. I experimented with how low I could turn the thermostat and adapt in winter by wearing more clothes and getting more active. My choices were partly about land use, energy, other environmental issues. They were also about the unfairness of driving and eating meat in a world where most people can't. And there was something about not wanting to kill. After I learned to drive as a teenager, I had a couple of small mishaps. And I knew that if I drove regularly, I would probably kill somebody. So I was motivated by that. I was motivated by my own health and fitness, by saving money, by being self-sufficient, and much more. Being a vegan cyclist was a way of being in control of my own life. My choices connect closely with my core faith values as a Quaker, with Jewish and Buddhist influences of non-violence, of equality, simplicity, and integrity. Of being willing to look deeply at how I am part of the problems in the world, and in Quaker language, answering that of God in everyone. In any case, the greatest effects of our choices may not be directly on carbon emissions. They may be in creating a new normal, in letting other people see the attractions of a joyful, gentle, mindful, healthy way of living on the earth. One of the most powerful forms of advocacy within our own families and communities, or with global politicians and business leaders, is to let our lives speak. Could we have the next slide? So I want to invite you to reflect. What are the real issues that you hope this initiative, Living the Change, will address? And what do you see as the biggest questions for us in this 8-week leadership program? And I just want to invite you to take a few minutes to write, reflect and write. It might be on a piece of paper. Actually, if you've got a journal that you're using through these sessions, that could be a really good way of working with material, or in a document on your computer. We'll have 3 minutes to do that, and then I'll invite you to share in the chat panel with the whole group. So I'll hand over to Carolina to take you into the next bit.
So after that moment of personal reflection, which is important and which we will have from time to time in our meetings, I invite those of you who feel like they would want to share their answers with the whole group to bring them to the chat bar and to post that to everyone. But only if you like to. What is more important is that you know for yourself your answers. So some people have started already. And I'm going to read out a few of them, just for all of us to hear it, also those people on the phone. David writes, building stronger bridges and not higher walls. Mary writes, the real issues for me have to be feeling like the lone green and seeing on a continual basis how my church community and the larger community consumes and disposes of without question, and how I or we might help to build more resilience within our communities. Rianne is writing, biggest question for our 8 weeks, to encourage and support each other, how we can recycle, adapt our respective ideas across creation, and also leave legacy from this program for others to continue building on it. Mohammed is writing, the real issue is to become informed about the challenges from climate change and the possible ways to reduce its impacts. I'm gonna read 2 more, and you can read all of them in the chat bar as well. Chris is writing, real issues are the practical issues, real active opportunities to be employed by companies, councils, and governments to facilitate change. And Surinder is writing, how to keep Earth livable so that when I, as a Hindu, am born again, Earth is pleasant as it is now and not a burning hell. And on question number 2, how to go back, consuming fewer resources, something most poor countries know but want to escape from. Thank you all for your contributions. It's very important to hear already the different perspectives and dimensions of what this entails. And I'm now delighted to go back to Laurie to no, actually, that's my part, to now introduce our 2 speakers for today to give their perspectives and experience on sustainable living and what the real issues are, what the real problems and biggest questions are. I'm delighted to introduce Kate Power, who joined us from Copenhagen, as you know. She's an expert on sustainable consumption, sustainable living. She works with the KR Foundation, manages the programs on sustainability. And I'm now handing over to Kate and her presentation for this next part. Thank you.
Thanks, Caroline. Thanks for inviting me to join you today. So why don't we live sustainably? So some of you are already experts in this. You will know that the academic field of sustainable consumption and behaviour change is huge, and we could spend the whole week doing that. So I'm just going to summarise it very bluntly for you, that the more you care about the environment and climate change, the bigger your environmental footprint is likely to be. So the more you care about climate change, the higher your impact probably is. So that's a bit not what we expect. What's the reason for that? So people who care about climate change and environmental issues tend to be well educated, they tend to have better jobs, and they tend to have more money. And what we know from the research is that income is the biggest predictor of environmental footprint. So as much as we care about climate change, we still live in a society based on a growth-based economy, and that growth is based on material consumption. And it tends to be the case that the more we earn, then the more we consume. It's not always, but that's often true. The income is the biggest predictor of footprint. So we're going to look at that in a different way on the next slide now. So we're going to see that the richest 10% of people in the world are responsible for almost half of total lifestyle consumption emissions. So 10% of people using about half of, causing about half of the emissions. So for me, sustainable living is about breaking this trend through changes in values, through social norms, government policies, infrastructure that can promote sustainable ways of living and organising our society. So we're not really close to sustainable living at the moment, which is, you know, it's quite surprising given that a lot of people do care about living sustainably. So then it begs the question, do we even know what sustainable living really means? What does it look like? So let's move on to the next slide. Now, you don't need to look too closely at the numbers because this is a slide from 2014 data. So the numbers are a little different. As we know, emissions have increased since then, but it gives you a little bit of an idea of the kind of per capita emissions that you can see in different countries in the world. And there's a red line on there which shows you the average per person emissions, which is somewhere between 5 and 6 tons of CO2 per person. That's the same today. And I have just myself drawn the green line on there to indicate roughly what we think a sustainable level of CO2 emissions would look like if it was shared equally among all the people in the world, as the Paris Agreement calls for. It has an equity perspective. So there's many different, there's not total agreement on what sustainable living means in terms of CO2 emissions per person, but generally it's thought to be between 0 and 3 tons per capita. I'm using here 1.5 tons per capita, which is used, for example, in One Planet Living by Global Footprint Network. And I'm also used by the researcher Jenny Moore, who's done some research into what life looks like for people who already live at what we'd call a One Planet Living level. What does their life look like? So let's move on to the next slide. So people who live sustainably today, and just to be clear, they live sustainably, most of them, because they live in poor countries such as Mali, Ecuador, Cuba, India, Haiti, Ethiopia, Philippines, Guatemala, these kinds of countries. And it's varied within those countries as well, but we can get an idea of what that looks like. So as I said, 1.5 tons of CO2 per capita, a mostly vegetarian diet, people sharing homes, and about 8 square meters of living space per person, a lot of shared use of televisions and computers, almost no people owning cars, very little driving, and flying almost never. So this is not a plan. This doesn't tell us what we have to, you know, what we should live like. It just gives you a snapshot of people who live at a roughly sustainable level now, and what kind of technologies we have now and what's available to them. So they're not living necessarily anywhere where we live, just to give you a bit of a picture that we're talking about. Roughly, for people who live in rich countries now, we might be looking at reducing our emissions by about 90% in order to live sustainably. So I kind of focus a lot on the big emissions areas that we've talked about already today, like flying, driving, eating meat, house size. But sometimes I come across research that really puts it in a different perspective for me and makes me realize just how far we've got to come. So I'm going to show you now, if we move on to the next slide, a piece of research that really had a big impact on me. And this is from glaciologists in Europe looking at the Alps and how the actions that we take today will have repercussions for years, for decades, for centuries. So they calculated in their work that for every kilo of CO2 we emit today, we will cause 15 kilos of glacier melt in the long term. And they looked at roughly what a sort of new German efficient car would emit, and they calculated that you would melt a kilo of glacier ice for every 500 meters you drive. So this really had a big impact on me, thinking it's not just the big things, it's everything. It's really a transformation of the way we live and the way we organize our societies in terms of what we need to do. And we often hear, when we hear about climate change, we often hear a lot about technical fixes, such as electric cars, and a lot of focus on renewable energy. And I'm going to show you the next slide now, if we can move on one, of why we need to reduce the amount of energy we use before we start looking at renewables and other technical fixes. So if you look at this graph, it's probably very typical kind of pathway that you're used to seeing. If you looked at IPCC reports, Paris Agreement, you can see how what's called a carbon budget, how much CO2 we can still theoretically emit without crossing 1.5 or 2 degrees of warming. So here they're using a fairly typical carbon budget of about 600 to 800 gigatons. Some people would put it a lot less. And then some researchers have been looking at how much energy it would take us to transition to renewable energy. So obviously you don't just switch it on, you need to create that infrastructure. Building everything that you need for renewable energy. And they found that would take about 790 gigatons to transition the world to renewable energy with our current levels of demand. That's more than the carbon budget that's available for 1.5 degrees of warming. So without actually using anything or doing anything else, no sustainable development goals, nothing else, that would be gone. So we can't just rely on renewables to solve all our problems for us. This is current demand. This is not including electrification of transport, electric cars, all the rest of it. So we really need to reduce demand in order to make the other solutions possible. So now let's move on to some good news. Let's move on to the next slide. This is some research which basically shows that if we do some simple lifestyle changes, like reduce our heating and cooling of our homes, reduce our meat consumption, and reduce our use of flying and driving, then we would free up a lot of resources, energy and land use in particular. We would be able to use the land for example, reforestation, and we would reduce our reliance on technical fixes, negative emissions technologies in particular. So also people like people who are modeling the global transitions for climate change are also seeing that changing our lifestyles is going to make a massive difference to how successful we are. So let's move on to the next slide. So with all this information, it can be a little overwhelming. You might think that I'm only just one person. Can my little carbon emissions and my little changes that I make, can they really make a difference? And I'm going to mention some of the reasons why I believe they can. I think Lindsay's going to pick up that afterwards as well. So although our emissions personally might be fairly limited, as people working on environmental issues, our emissions count more than other people's, because other people watch what we are doing and they find out how seriously we should take this from people like us. So it's really a credibility influence, and it's an opportunity for us to have a positive influence on what's counted as normal in society. And I will point you to a website called No Fly Climate Sci. So it's a group of climate scientists and other academics who have made a commitment to either not fly or reduce their flying. Small individual changes, but they realize that if they don't do it, then nobody else is going to take it seriously. Another reason I've listed is because people like me, born in a Western country, we have ecological privilege. So it's legal and possible, and we can afford to use a huge amount of resources, which is way more than our fair share. So as people with that ecological privilege, we have also a responsibility to not abuse it. Another reason is that if we're going to make this transition, we need to learn how to live sustainably, starting now. So we need to experiment with actually doing it, because this is not just about mitigation, it's also about adaptation. Another reason is that if we're really serious about climate change, then this needs to start looking like an emergency. Our lives and the way we conduct ourselves, we should be acting as if we really think it is an emergency, and things need to change very deeply and very quickly. And our lives should look very different from the mainstream norms. It should be noticeable to other people that we who believe in taking action on climate change do things differently. Now, for sure, some of you will have already started, and you will meet resistance. So I've framed this for myself in terms of behavioural activism. So the way I live my life is part of a form of activism. You might also meet resistance from people who call it the lifestyle delusion, saying that just changing your life is a distraction, an apolitical distraction from top-down systems change. I think that the two go together. Systems change is also made up from bottom-up change as well as top-down change. But whichever way you do it, bottom-up, top-down, or a mixture of both, there's no avoiding the fact that our life needs to change. It's not possible to prevent environmental degradation without changing our lifestyles. If you're going to have a zero carbon society, your way of living will certainly change. And then there's more resistance from people who say it's unrealistic, it's not politically feasible to change societies at that scale. I really look out for these people, because what they really mean, what they're really saying is coming from a place of fear, in my opinion. What they're really saying is, I don't want to do that. But it can be very powerful when people just tell you that what you're doing is a waste of time. So I'd really encourage you to not let that derail you, and to use this opportunity we have today to really get in touch with your own personal motivation for doing this work. So we'll just move on to the last slide, and I'll tell you about my personal motivation. I don't just want to do this kind of work and live this way just because I think it's necessary or because I see that it's very effective, but also because I think it's the right thing to do with my ecological privilege, and I feel called to do that and to put myself in that uncomfortable position of standing up against mainstream society, because I believe what's considered a normal and inevitable way of living is wrong, it's morally wrong, and it has to change. And last point, is that I was just recently with Caroline lucky enough to attend a climate change conference at the Vatican. So I was very interested to hear how that community would talk about sustainable living. And in fact, they didn't use those words at all, but they constantly talked about integrity and the integrity between our beliefs and our words and our actions. So for me, that sums up really why I want to do this, my motivation for doing this work, because for me, living the change is my opportunity to demonstrate my integrity. So I'll leave it for that and look forward to your questions later. Thank you.
Kate, thank you so much, and for giving that overview. There are some of the shocking numbers that we need to know about, but also really what motivates and what empowers us for sustainable living. All the participants have been super active in already asking questions, asking feedback. This is just a reminder that all the questions will go to the final moment of this session, and our speakers will have some time to read through your comments and to prepare themselves for a final round. Thank you very much, Kate. And we are now handing over to Lindsey, and Laurie will introduce her.
So, yes, so a really warm welcome to Lindsey Field, a cook. Lindsey is, as she's told us, she's a Quaker. She's based in Bonn, and for the last 8 years, I think, she's been spending a lot of time in the climate negotiations and having very close conversations with the negotiators and with the secretariat there. So she's very close to the political process around this, and from that perspective, we hope she's going to bring a lot to this. So over to you, Lindsey.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right? Okay. Briefly, I want to give you a short background of how we got involved in climate change, in case that's relevant to many of you in your faith communities, why sustainable behavior really matters, the role of religious communities, and what motivates us. And briefly, for the Quaker UN office and Quakers in general, we have an office based at the UN in New York and Geneva, and we started after World War II to help support the UN in peace and justice issues. But it wasn't until 2012 that we became involved in climate change. And the turning point for us was realizing that our work on human rights, peace, and food and sustainability would be profoundly affected by rising global temperatures. And we recognize in this that climate change is a peace and justice concern. And that was how we got into it. If you go to, oops, I think we have a slide. Do I have my first slide? Okay, now we're in the pictures. Could you go back just one, the first one? Or is it not there? Okay, we'll go into the pictures then. The first picture, I've put these all together for you. I wanted you to see at the top, you've got this round circle of negotiators. That's the UNFCCC, the International Climate Change Negotiations. And we started this work in 2013 to bring together in off-the-record dinners, negotiators from a very diverse group of countries. And the idea was to build communication and understanding between these countries because they were so blocked in trying to get forward on a universal climate change agreement. And why was it blocked? It's a lot of anger in the room that this is fair, that is not fair, you've screwed me, I need help. It was painful to watch. And so our small contribution was to work with these negotiators, and that work continues. We also, as a faith community, we do publications to support the negotiation process, and side events, we bring in specialist speakers to look at climate change as an ethical concern, whether it's peace building over stress on natural resources, or human rights and climate change, or sustainable behavior. And then in 2016, we became an observer of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, known as the IPCC. Most of you, I'm sure, may be aware of this, but those who aren't, they are the body that advise the negotiators and all our governments on the latest climate findings. And so when we became an observer, we learned through Laurie that we were one of two faith communities who were official observers at the IPCC. The other was a Catholic university. And in having that unusual position of a faith-based background, we prioritize climate justice and sustainable behavior as our main message to these climate scientists. And I will carry on later about that. So sustainable behavior, why does it matter? So the international climate change negotiations, unfortunately, when you're there, you realize they're more about economics than climate change. It's more about the finances. It's more about my advantage, your advantage, because the root causes of climate change are very lucrative. There are very lucrative activities, whether we are extracting or the combustion of fossil fuels, oil, gas, coal, whether it's deforestation, or what we call black carbon, incomplete combustion, yeah? Or transport, trucks, cars, airplanes, chlorofluorocarbons, air conditioning, intensive animal farming, meat. Okay, all these have a lot of money in them. And these root causes are driven by, according to the IPCC, to quote, economic and population growth. And so you have this side of it, but against that, you have people who are aware that this is threatening the stability of their country. And most negotiators in that room recognize that climate change is a great threat, but how do they proceed forward in a way that's fair and effective? And one of the reasons that sustainable behavior is increasingly important for us as an issue is because we're seeing and we're witnessing a greater increase in the negotiation community, in the political decision-making communities, across the board, developing, and also in climate scientists who are trying to figure out how we're going to do this, in what we call geoengineering. And geoengineering could include bioenergy, growing crops to create fuel, carbon capture storage, where you pump the CO2 down into the ground, solar radiation, sulfate aerosols. These are not proven at mass scale, but they are gaining increased recognition as a possible way forward. That's very scary to us because in our view of this, and I think in most scientists' view, they don't actually address the root causes, the disease. They may try to address symptoms, but if you don't address the disease, you keep hitting the symptoms. So a couple little anecdotes I have had on sustainable behavior. I've had a negotiator say, oh, but we couldn't ask our citizens to do that. And then I hear citizens and grassroots communities saying, why aren't our governments doing more? Now there's this disconnect. And then you have climate scientists who are stuck there and with huge pressures to give these answers, who are not getting the encouragement from politicians to give sustainable alternatives. They're, give us the quick answer and our economy can continue the way it is. So they're under pressure. But I've also heard some scientists say, if we speak too bluntly about how serious and critical is this urgent situation, it could cause panic. Or another said, very high up in mitigation, said, yes, 1.5 C, keeping global temperatures to that rise is possible, but we don't have the political will. And so you hear all these and you think, okay, what is it that we can offer? And I speak here now as religious communities. In our experience, and I'm sure in many of your experiences, what we see is that the faith or religious voice can offer an empowering voice of hope over fear, of compassion over indifference, and of urgent and fair action as a moral obligation. And I stress moral. I think there is a moral voice in what we say. If the Pope Francis sits down with oil CEOs and talks about their moral obligation, he touches something that is very difficult for someone to do in a political way. And that was also why we could do the work and do the work with the climate change negotiators, because we are not seen as a political entity or a state. We actually are seen as something sort of odd, more genuine in caring for the common good. And I see also in religious communities a personal witness aside of political action. You be examples in the world that we can and want to change. And when you have that personal witness, when you engage with the decision makers, you engage in a state of integrity and a state of actual examples that we can do this. And the critical side of both cannot be underestimated, because also without the political action, we don't have the policies, and laws are critical. Regulation is important. But what we are in making those witness positions and that visibility that it's possible, what we offer, excuse me for the bells, we show that we want it. We show those negotiators that people want this and it is possible, and that we don't go to crazy other solutions, because actually this is a place where we can use how we live. And finally, I just want to give you a quick example. I think something that many of you in your communities who were involved in the abolition of slavery, in the Quaker situation, if Quakers as a whole had stopped having slaves, which most of them did, that in itself wouldn't have stopped slavery, the actual trading of slavery. But you needed both. You needed that personal witness that I will stop, and then you need the political engagement to actually change the laws. And so I often find there are lessons learned from the past that we can use now. So finally, what motivates us? Love, hope, kindness, mercy, liberation. I think this is across all of our communities, elements which unite the faiths. Love for God's creation, love for our neighbors worldwide, and for all our children. And the faith, as someone mentioned before, the faith communities are very strong communities. And when we reach out to that, we have a base that others don't, and it crosses borders. For me personally, my past work was humanitarian work in conflict or war zones, and I saw failed states. And the more I started to learn about climate change, the more I could see where this could go. And so I went back to graduate school to study. But also part of that influence was moving to Germany. And in Germany, I am in a world where I see an intergenerational guilt. I sense this around me. There are very few good stories that the current generation have from their parents or grandparents about what they did to stop the inhumanity through the Nazism. And then you have this weight of what did you do? And that was very moving to me, because I thought, okay, well, what is our greatest challenge? You can move to the next slide. What is our greatest challenge? Is there another slide? Whoops, no, it's just that one. Okay, go back to the picture slide. Okay, if you look to the left, you have this black square. I'm really sorry about these bells. If you go to the Black Square, you'll see the Stockholm Resilience Institute put together planetary boundaries. And what's very powerful about that is that when we live sustainably and justly on this earth, it not only helps the root causes of climate change, it helps all the other environmental crises which are ongoing, biodiversity or species extinction being probably in the greatest crisis right now, and climate change rising. That's a very useful tool, but there is also, if we had the other slide, I guess we don't, a version of that of how we live sustainably on this earth, which is called the Oxfam Donut. I'm going to stop there. I have some quotes from the IPCC later, if you'd like, on how the work we did to bring climate scientists with faith communities was a strong impact. And then also we see the IPCC engaging more in sustainable behavior, what they call lifestyle behavior consumption. I'll turn off the bells. Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay. I think your other slides actually went in at the end of the presentation, so you'll have a chance to speak to them when we come in at the end. Sorry, Estrella, can we go back to...
You just saw the donut.
Just seen everything, yes. So we have a couple of minutes now, and we've heard a lot of different perspectives on why this matters. And I want to invite you just to have a couple of minutes to reflect, gather to yourself. Why does sustainable living matter to you? And we'll have 2 minutes. If you've got a journal, that's fantastic. If you've got a bit of paper, if you've got a document on your PC, that's great. But please do write and hold on to it for yourself. Why does this matter for you?
Okay, and with those thoughts on your notebook and in your heads and minds and souls, we now invite you to actually go into the small groups for a very first time. A quick reminder, just after my announcement, there will be something on your screen. You will be assigned randomly to a breakout room of 4 or 5 people. And please accept this invitation so that you will be automatically moved to that room. We will call you back after 10 minutes sharply. So that should give everyone enough time to share about the 2 questions. Number 1, introduce yourself briefly and share 1 line on why sustainable living matters to you. You can share that in the small group. It will not leave that small group. So it's really for you only. And number 2, from your context, why do you think it might matter to others in your faith community? Try to have the perspective of other faith members in your community. Welcome back, everyone. We would like to hear a bit from your feedback from the breakout rooms, and then we'll hear final thoughts from our speakers. I would ask 1 person from the group who maybe facilitated the conversation to share a few highlights from your conversation. So not everyone needs to share their own thoughts, but why don't you share some highlights in the chat bar, which everyone can read and which we will record.
Actually, I think it doesn't have to be one person if we put it in the chat, because it'll all be recorded. So if you have an urge to share what came up in your group in the chat, then please do.
And people on the phone can hit **9 if they want to raise their hand, so we're able to also hear them. Okay, so asking again, feedback from your groups. What is it that faith communities can contribute? And what are the next concrete steps that you would see or wish to see?
This is Carol Green from our breakout group, and faith communities' biggest contribution we thought was the deep credibility of the faith community, which when combined with other groups that are involved with the climate and climate justice movements, will have a tremendous impact. So the gifts that the faith community can contribute are what's happening right now, was sort of where we were coming from. What would be a good first step is we liked what's happening now, which is to figure out how we can live more sustainably and then help that to become viral with the people that we're working with. But one of the issues that we really started working on was the obstacles, of course, which in the United States is the culture and the convenience. And we recognize that overcoming our culture of our rich culture is going to be a very large obstacle, and we would welcome comments from the rest of the group on how to work with people to not see this as doing with less, but giving more.
Thank you very much, Carol, for sharing from your group. Very important aspect, and I think that so many people of faith in this training will actually be able to contribute to your question over the course of the next weeks. Thank you, everyone who's contributing in the chat bar. Again, this will be recorded, and I now want to hand over to our speakers, to Kate and then to Lindsey, to share some final thoughts and respond to some of your questions which you have posed earlier. So giving the word to Kate first. Thank you, Kate.
Thanks very much, and I just apologise because I'm working from a cafe and there's a bit of noise behind me, so sorry for that. I hope you can hear me. So thanks for your great questions. Some of them you're going to talk about in more detail during later parts of this course. For example, very big and complex questions about population growth and different types of impacts of different activities. So I'll just come to one that I thought was a very interesting question: how to get more positive media coverage for all the good stuff that's happening. And what an important question, because as we said, it's very difficult to communicate the very shocking truth about our situation right now. And as Lindsey talked about, the possibility of people panicking. And it's fantastic when we're telling people what's going on, that we can also give them a sense of agency by talking about what they can do, local initiatives that they can join and be part of in their community, or even national or international initiatives. So I thought that was a great question, which I'm sure you'll discuss more during the course of this. There were specific questions, for example, about vegetarianism and CO2 emissions, and I think a short answer to that will be around land use and deforestation in order to grow crops and to raise cattle, for example. But it's not just about CO2, of course, methane and other environmental impacts. Is air travel a reason why people have, rich people have a bigger footprint? Yes, 90% of people in the world will never get on an aeroplane in their life. And so we need to be aware of that when we're planning all our climate change related events. So how fantastic that we're seeing now how well it works when we meet with our international friends and colleagues online, and what a lot we can do now without having to fly. But of course, there's much more to our footprint, our house size, the way the car driving, our food consumption, general consumption. So again, that's a very complex issue. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that. But yeah, thanks for your last comment about not doing less, but about giving more. I thought that was fantastic. I'll take that with me.
And now shall we hear from Lindsey? It might be good to have that Lindsey's other slide if we can move on to that next
Actually,
slide.
do you have the one on the Quaker statement? If you have that.
Can we have that one for a moment?
Sure. I wanted to quickly answer. I saw a question about the Paris Agreement, and that that geoengineering is already part of how we would get to the proposed goals, and that is correct in terms of BECCS, bioenergy and carbon capture storage. But what is the real concern is that BECCS, bioenergy, carbon capture storage, has been assumed in climate modeling to the point where it's almost not realized how much has been assumed in that. And what is not sufficiently being engaged in is how our lifestyles, sustainable behavior, sustainable consumption would actually affect mitigation. And so there was a recent climate modeling paper, peer-reviewed, published from Utrecht University in the Netherlands, which showed how reduced meat would make a significant impact on GHG emissions. And it's that what we're trying to push. We're trying to encourage this because there is a pushback from governments to engage in sustainable behavior or sustainable economic systems because our economic models are so dependent on consumption, at least those that are the worst causing for greenhouse gas emissions. And then just to leave you with the final comments, someone wrote about acceptance, and I bring in also responsibility and accountability. These are the things I find in religious communities that we embrace. And if we can embrace them, we give courage to people to embrace that. And it's okay. If we're part of this problem, we're part of the solution. And I think if you get people together in a small space and get them to talk about what they're seeing in the changes around them, and just get them quietly to talk about what they see, whether or not we agree on the political side of it, what is happening and what could we do to be part of a solution? And that's an empowerment. And I think when people do make changes, none of us are perfect. You know, some of us live more sustainable lives than others. That's okay. Just start doing what you can and you'll actually feel better because you're actually part of something good as opposed to sitting back and panicking. And it is a very scary situation. So I would encourage us to use that hope and hope over fear and compassion over indifference as our great strengths that we can contribute. That's all. And that was the slide you see from what the Stockholm Resilience Institute offered. And again, there are not just climate, there are a number of environmental crises which are caused by how we're living on Earth. But then the Oxfam donor, Kate Laurie, last name Ratsworth, I believe. Roworth, put together and transformed this into a very beautiful and positive way of looking at how do we address these crises. Because when we help on one, we help with the others. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lindsey and Kate. Thank you for sharing your wisdom, your experience, your knowledge, and your motivations with us, your deep motivation. Very inspiring. We're almost at the end of this call, and just by seeing what everyone is contributing in the chat bar, I'm very excited about this group. I'm very excited that they to ask the difficult questions, who are ready to contribute with their experience and with their ideas. And this is only the start. So I now have the privilege to share with you about the next steps. And that for that, I will need the next slide, please. So what we ask you to do until the next session, to not stay inactive or to not forget everything that you have heard. We ask you to ask these questions in your community as well, in your faith community. And the proposal here is to identify and approach different voices in your community and try to have at least 3 conversations about sustainable living in the coming 2 weeks. And it would be great if you really focus on listening to them, not sharing so much with what you learned today, but listening and taking notes of what their answer is and analyze that. You can take notes afterwards. Sometimes that's nicer in a one-to-one conversation, or during the conversation if that's fine for them. So that's a learning exercise for you, and also becoming more aware of how people in your faith community, in your peer group, think about sustainable living. And you're welcome to use the same questions that we have asked today, which we will share later on in an email, and ask those questions to them as a conversation starter. We wish you lots of fun with that, and lots of joy and good conversations. And in our next meeting, we will then hear some of the results from those inquiry. Thank you. Handing over to Laurie and the next slide.
So, yes, so the next meeting is, the theme is, can we really change? The psychology of individual behavior change. It is on Monday the 3rd of September, same time as this one. We will be working on our fluency with the technology and making sure that you have all the information beforehand. I think I should say there are some other things we've talked about that we haven't quite got sorted out yet, but which is to make sure you have the ability to communicate with each other between sessions. And we're conscious that some issues came up in the chat, which we were expecting, like population, which will need in-depth conversations and which we can't do justice to in this kind of setting. So we're thinking about whether it's a Google group or some other process, but we will be making sure that people can share stuff in detail and explore between sessions.
Great, thank you. So as a follow-up, after this meeting, in the next 2 days, we will send you the recording of this meeting. We will send you the presentation, and both of those things are only available for registered participants, so they will not automatically be for sharing with others, but you're of course invited to use them as a basis for presenting some of the learnings to your own community. Your leaders, you know how to handle this and how to prepare, use this information, these learnings, the questions for your own community. But you will be shared that. We will also share some of the questions that came up in the chat bar. No worries, we will not share all the technical questions or the personal presentations, but some of your questions were so important that we will bring them to our email group. Again, they will not be shared with people outside of this group, so that we continue our conversations and gather our thoughts. Thank you. Last slide and last moment of this meeting, again, is a spiritual moment. And we all need to take a deep breath now, and Laurie will guide us in the final meditation.
So in a moment, I'll ask Kristin to do her thing with the bell, and I invite you to just hold the intention for this work, that we can work with our faith communities over the coming weeks to develop a shared action for sustainable living.